Welcome to Dungeon Brew. I am Josh, and this is my series on world building where I lead you through a collection of videos on how I build worlds for ttrpgs. So kick back, relax, and I will see you on the other side of the intro. Salutations, my fellow primates. Today we're going to be talking about how we develop the geography and the maps for the world that you are building for your ttrpg. Now, we've talked about some different parameters for what we're considering in regards to the world that we're building for this series, but hopefully this is helpful information for you just in terms of developing that initial map and starting to think about the geography for your own world that you're creating for your tabletop role-playing game. Now, typically when we are creating a world, we're basing it off of what we know in our own reality, which typically means that we're basing it off of physics as we know it, because we want to have there to be some sort of governing rules around the reality in our fantasy role-playing game. So for instance, we typically borrow things from our natural world. We have worlds that are round. We have a solar system, we have a sun, and we have a moon or multiple moons. There's a standard day that is developed, which really helps us with most rule sets that are out there. There's usually a tilt that's in our planet that helps cause the seasons and makes things rather predictable for the players as they are traversing through this world that you've built. Now, we can make slight adjustments to this where your world can have days that go anywhere from 22 hours to like 26 hours, or a year may range from 340 days to 400 days. Maybe the planet is a different size than what Earth is, or maybe it has a different rotation or different weather patterns. Maybe there's different geographic structures that exist within this world, enough to give us this feeling that we're playing a fantasy game without having to understand a completely different reality. Because really what you're aiming to do here is to set your players into a world that they can explore and have fun with, but it doesn't disrupt their suspension of disbelief, so they still feel like they're immersed within the world that you're building. Now, with this understanding, typically where I start with is thinking about tectonic plates. And I know John did a really great video in exploring different features of geography. In all truth, I don't get in as depth as he does unless I'm creating my own world, which I have created my own fantasy world before for like my books that I write, and we've played games in that world because I come to it again and again to play in that world, the setting and the cultures and all these things that I've developed over the years. But if I'm just creating like a world for a short episodic campaign, or a campaign that's going to last 6 months and I'm not going to come back to it again, I may not get as like detailed in the world itself that I'm building. But typically I would start with something like understanding the tectonic plates, and that's important for me because I want to understand mountain ranges and where they've developed throughout the world that I'm creating. Now, these could be continental or oceanic mountain ranges. Some of these could be active, other ones could be inactive. For instance, we have active mountain ranges now in our known world, like the Himalayas, but there could be inactive chains like the Urals that are just kind of erosion based, or like even like the Appalachian Mountains that are here in the United States. Now, active chains have earthquakes and volcanic activity that can occur. You may have both things actually occurring within those. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think that like Chile has more earthquakes, but not really volcanic activity because of how those specific mountain ranges developed, where other ones will have more volcanic activity. But this is important to me because of, again, the parameters that we've developed for the game that I'm creating. It's going to be based around the story of these gods. And this is of particular interest to me because historically, many prominent gods in our own history as human beings have related around gods associated with volcanoes. And so I want to understand the mountain ranges in the world that I'm building. So I have a good place for my orphan god, as we talked about in our pantheon, to reside in, which means that I need to have a continental mountain range that has active volcanoes as a central point for my story. So we'll come back to that, but that piece is important. Another thought that's permeating is that I also want this to be reflective of a diesel punk setting. We had talked about that in the previous video as well. And so it's important to me that my world is old enough and developed enough that it allows for that type of technology to exist. Now, I can make caveats as a GM and just kind of force certain things into existence in my world without a lot of explanation, but I really don't want to have anything to occur that, again, takes my players out of immersion. I want it to make sense for why things are where they are in the story that's being told. So in order for me to be at a level in terms of the evolution of the world and the people within it, I need to make sure that it's old enough. So how does this reflect back to geography? Immediately in my mind, I'm thinking that I have to be able to allow for there to be particular chemical and mechanical weathering that's taken place in the world that's reflective in the land formations that have developed. This should show maybe weakening land masses or even crumbling mountain ranges, areas where erosion is really visible to the naked eye. So my character should be able to walk, throughout the steppes or along the tundra and see the impacts of a world that's a little bit older and that's been impacted not only by the natural processes and climatic conditions within that world, but also perhaps due to the technological advances of the sentient beings that are on that world. And so I want to include things like climatic erosion and seeing how this has shaped land masses and shaped features of the world in a natural way. Now on Earth, if we're going back to what we know, most of Earth is covered in water, right? 70% of the Earth is covered in water. And this oftentimes allows for much of the erosion that we see outside of, wind patterns. But just in terms of its natural erosion, even on coastlines, is due to the water that we have. So if I want to consider having this be a part of my world, I want to make sure that my world as well has enough water to cause this impact. Now, it doesn't mean that I have to have a lot of water. In fact, I can have, even with some of the technology that's developed, impact the water that is on the land. So maybe I want to have like 50% water and have there be a little bit more scarcity than what we see in our natural world. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do 50% water, maybe 15% ice in the world that we develop. So the next step that I take, if I'm not going to hand draw this map, which I've done this before, I've hand drawn maps, but as I've gotten older and I'm running multiple games, I've started using more auto generated maps that can be found through free sites. There's a few that I really enjoy using, and I want to talk about this because generating the map is the next step that I go to. This is before I really consider biomes or climates or even weather patterns. I want to get a rough idea of what I'm working with. So there are 4 free online map generators that I primarily use that would be in my top 4 to utilize anytime that I'm trying to create a map. And so what I did is I went to each one of these and started creating some maps and throwing out some options to see what I would have to work with. And the first one that I went to was 𝐃𝐨𝐬𝐤. Now, 𝐃𝐨𝐬𝐤 doesn't allow me to adjust for the ice and the water levels, at least not on the free version. And it did give me a nice world map with some mountain ranges that were included in here. And it gave me enough space that I was able to work with potentially putting in multiple biomes in this area, but it didn't really give me what I was envisioning in my head to work with. And so I kind of passed over it fairly quickly. And then I went to D20SRD, which has its own map generator. And this is one that I think works well for maybe a quick game that I want to create, or if I need something like on the fly or an initial idea of what I want to utilize. But the placement of the mountains and the map itself didn't really feel very intuitive. It didn't seem like it was fitting real geographical rules or climatic rules, and I didn't want to play with it all day just to get it right. I went to Donjon, which I think is probably superior in comparison to D20SRD, and I put in that I wanted 50% water and 15% ice, and again, it gave me some space to move with, but again, it didn't feel as though it was intuitive as I wanted it to be. So that left me with 𝐿𝐵𝐺𝐻, and I would prefer that I had some additional options of having land masses on this map to make it a bigger world, but I really did like the centralized mountain range that provided for me in the middle, which gives me some potential volcanic activity that I can work with. And I like that I could centralize the story on that landmass. And I like that I have the freedom to add some biomes to this map and add cities and names to things fairly easily without having to play around a lot. I can save just this image down and then be creative in the development of the world that I'm building on this map. And immediately in mind, I'm thinking that this really reflects well this world that's maybe imitative of the Rangipo Desert that's in New Zealand, or even the Pumice Desert that's in the United States, or even the highlands of Iceland. Like if I'm thinking about biomes and regions, especially in regards to the centerpiece of this particular map, that works really well for me and what it is that I'm envisioning for the story that I'm going to be telling. So in the center of this map, I'm looking for a region that's going to actually have quite a bit of rainfall and even heavy snows during the winter months, but it's going to remain somewhat flat, and it's going to have this barren desert-like environment due to the poor soil quality, due to the volcanic activity, the eruptions that are taking place, and the volcanic ash that's going to accompany that. And the area north of this might be a little barren despite some of the rainfall that it's having, and I might have some weather patterns up there that are also helping shape the land. So all these things are kind of generating in my mind as I'm looking at this and thinking about how is the weather going to look in this world specifically. Now these rivers, I might have to eliminate some of them or maybe make them less notable in the course of the game because they may not be as frequented based on what exactly is going on. But depending on the scale of the land here, some of those rivers may be able to remain in their current location. I want the central region to be alpine biome or a desert biome, even maybe a steppe biome in that area. And as I venture further to the south or the north, I might see some taiga and some tundra starting to take shape. If I'm having, again, like 15% of ice on here, those ice shelves to the top and the bottom of this may start expanding over this continent that I have. The coasts may give up more of a like moist continental climate with some deciduous forests, or even a Mediterranean climate in the eastern portion of the realm, especially if I'm looking at this and being very reflective of New Zealand and how it works. And this is going to be important to me when I start to consider the flora and fauna that I'm going to be populating this particular continent with later on. What else do I want to consider? I want to consider that there's probably going to be a rain shadow with this centralized mountain range, where there's going to be more moisture on the northern side of the mountain and less precipitation on the southern side of the mountain. This is going to be important in understanding, the more wet and dry or arid landscapes that might exist on either side. And when I start a campaign, I'll tell you that I usually pick out where my first starting city is going to be. And because I want to centralize this around a potential orphan god that's a volcanic god, then I'm probably going to build a city somewhere close to this mountain range within viewpoint of it. And even though I may know that on the full of my map, I'm going to have timberlands and gorges and glens and velds and crags and outcroppings and all these different types of features, it's going to be centralized to where I'm going to build that initial city at and what their weather is going to be at and their climate is going to be at before I really start looking into the other areas of the map. I just want to know what might exist for maybe future considerations as I'm looking at other potential geographical features across the terrain. But in looking at that really specific city, I'm going to start building this on a quick Excel spreadsheet for me. And what you see in front of you is a really rough draft of something that's actually available in Castles and Crusades about average temperatures in Fahrenheit across different geographical landscapes. And for me, I know that this is going to be probably somewhere on either the desert or the steppe particular region for my initial city. And so I want to understand that this is where my weather is probably going to fall at. And so what I would do is create myself a city tab and start building out what the different seasons look like, what the average temperature is going to be like in that area, and also what the average precipitation is going to look like. And if I'm building this off of the desert in New Zealand, then they actually have more precipitation than normal that, again, does not have great growth in terms of vegetation because of the poor soil quality and the increased volcanic ash. And so I'm going to have it be reflective of that so that it's realistic for my players. I also want to notate that when you look at this map, you see that all the rivers are flowing to the center, which has to do with rivers flowing toward the equator or the center of gravity with the world spinning on its axis. And so this is just a fun tip for map making. When I get to building additional cities, which are typically near water sources to support like growth and sustenance, or to also maybe support transportation, trade, or even culture, this is going to be important. So in our next video, we're going to start looking at cultivating cultures and building some of these cities based on the features that we understand so far, after understanding some basic geography about what our world is and where we are working from in terms of the ground up. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Please hit that like button and the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys all again next time.
Dungeon Brew.